Long before romance was explained, it was observed. People watched the world around them closely. They noticed patterns in the way animals moved, returned, separated, and remained. These movements were not dramatic. They unfolded slowly, often over seasons, sometimes over years. But repetition gave them weight. What happened once could be ignored. What happened again and again began to matter. Animals stayed close to one another, or they did not. Some returned after long absences. Others disappeared and were never seen again. Certain pairs remained together through distance and change. Others met briefly and parted. None of this was understood as symbol at first. It was simply noticed. Before myths existed, there was watching. People lived alongside these animals. They shared the same land, the same water, the same weather. They saw how behavior repeated. They saw how certain patterns endured even when everything else changed. Over time, those patterns became familiar. Familiarity became meaning. Meaning became story. In the temples of Mesopotamia, in the forests of Europe, in the valleys of Asia, and in the deserts and shores of the Mediterranean, animals became symbols of desire, loss, fidelity, and change. The nightingale sang of sorrow. The dove carried devotion. The stag led seekers toward forbidden encounters. The swan embodied transformation itself. We will explore 6 animals and creatures deeply connected to the mythology of love and desire. We will move slowly through their stories, not only to understand the myths themselves, but what these creatures represented to the people who believed in them. Each section has its own weight, its own way of seeing. We begin with a bird whose song carries the weight of violation and loss. These stories were not written to explain the world precisely. They were shaped to remember it. They were passed along quietly, altered slightly as they moved from place to place. They were carried not as instruction, but as recognition. A story did not need to be exact to feel true. It only needed to reflect something already seen. Romance entered these stories not as comfort, but as tension. Attachment did not always mean permanence. Separation did not always mean loss. Desire could bind or unmake. Love could appear steady or dangerous depending on the form it took. Animals provided a language for these contradictions. Their behavior offered images that were easier to hold than abstract ideas. What survives now are fragments of that older thinking. Not a single system, but overlapping impressions. Myths that disagree with one another, legends that contradict themselves, stories that refuse to resolve neatly. This is not a collection of moral lessons. It is not a guide to how romance should work. It is a record of how people once tried to understand it by watching the world move around them. The stories unfold slowly. They are not meant to be held all at once. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to reach an ending. They continue at their own pace. Nightingales, love, loss, and lament. In the ancient world, particularly in Greece and Rome, the nightingale was not simply a bird admired for its beautiful song. It was understood as something more than that, and for many people, it carried the memory of tragedy. The bird's meaning extended beyond sound into memory, loss, and association. Long before the story of Philomela was written down, people had already learned to associate the bird with the night hours. The nightingale was rarely seen in daylight, and its presence was known almost entirely through sound. This mattered in cultures where voice was closely tied to identity, memory, and truth. A sound that emerged from darkness, unseen, carried a different weight than one that could be traced to a visible source. Listeners noticed that the song often arrived when other sounds had fallen away. It filled the space left behind after conversation, work, and movement had ended for the day. Because of this, the nightingale became linked to reflection rather than activity, to what lingered after events had already passed. The myth behind this association survives most clearly in Ovid's Metamorphoses, one of the central sources of classical Roman mythology. The story centers on a young woman named Philomela and the terrible wrong that was done to her. Ovid did not invent the story, but his version shaped how it would be remembered. Through his telling, the nightingale became fixed in cultural memory as a creature born from violence and loss rather than natural beauty alone. Philomela was the daughter of Pandion, king of Athens. Her sister, Procne, had married Tereus, a king from Thrace. After the marriage, the two sisters were separated for many years. Missing her younger sibling, Procne eventually asked her husband to travel to Athens and bring Philomela back for a visit. The separation of sisters mattered deeply in ancient storytelling. Family bonds, especially between siblings, were understood as sources of loyalty and protection. Their distance created vulnerability, a condition that the myth would exploit. Tereus agreed, but on the return journey, something terrible happened. Consumed by desire, he assaulted Philomela. Fearing that she would reveal what he had done, he cut out her tongue. He abandoned her in a forest cabin and returned home alone, telling Procne that her sister had died during the journey. In ancient societies, speech was power. To remove someone's voice was not only to silence them, but to erase their social presence. Philomela was not simply harmed, she was rendered unable to participate in the world that surrounded her. For many people, this story might have ended in silence and despair, but Philomela found a way to communicate her suffering by weaving a tapestry that depicted what had happened. Through thread and image, she told her story without words. Textiles in the ancient world were labor-intensive, valuable, and often symbolic. By weaving her story, Philomela transformed domestic craft into testimony. What could not be spoken became visible. When Procne saw the tapestry, her grief turned into rage. She rescued her sister and plotted revenge against Tereus. The details differ across versions of the myth, but the core remains consistent. Witnessing the chain of violence and suffering, the gods intervened through transformation. Transformation in Greek and Roman myth was rarely a reward. It froze suffering into a permanent form, removing it from human society without resolving it. In the version that became most influential through Roman culture, Procne was transformed into a swallow. Tereus became a hoopoe, Philomela became a nightingale. This transformation is significant. In nature, the female nightingale is silent while the male produces the famous song. Yet in mythology, Philomela, whose tongue was cut out, became the nightingale. Her transformation granted her the voice she had been denied. The contradiction did not trouble ancient listeners. Myth was not bound by biology. What mattered was meaning. The nightingale sang because Philomela could not. For centuries, the nightingale's song was understood as a lament rather than joy. Poets across Europe and the Mediterranean heard in it anguish and loss that could not be spoken any other way. The bird became a stand-in for experiences that language failed to contain. In medieval and Renaissance poetry, the nightingale became a familiar figure. Writers used it to express suffering over unrequited love. By this period, the myth was often assumed rather than retold. The bird alone was enough to evoke it. The name Philomela was later interpreted to mean lover of song. The irony was clear. A woman whose voice had been stolen came to embody the expression of love's darkest emotions. The mythology of the nightingale does not end in Greece and Rome. In medieval Persia, particularly in the poetry of the 14th century mystic Hafez, the bird took on a different but related meaning. In Persian poetry, the nightingale became the devoted lover and the rose the beloved. The nightingale sang endlessly to the rose, while the rose remained distant and still. Love was not mutual balance, it was pursuit. The nightingale loved with complete devotion and sacrifice. In Hafez's verses, the bird poured what he called drops of his heart's blood into caring for the rose. Suffering was not imposed, it was chosen. In both Greek and Persian traditions, the nightingale carried the same message. Love and suffering were inseparable. Love did not protect against loss, it deepened it. The nightingale remains the national bird of Iran. Across cultures and centuries, it has continued to represent the bittersweet nature of human desire, a creature that sings most beautifully when its heart is broken. Doves, fertility, attachment, and sacred union. If the nightingale is the symbol of longing and loss, the dove represents something different. The dove embodies attachment, devotion, fertility, and the bonds that hold beings together. Across landscapes shaped by migration, trade, and war, the dove was noticed for a quieter reason. It stayed, returned to the same places, and nested close to human dwellings rather than withdrawing into distant forests or mountains. Its presence was steady and familiar, and that steadiness mattered to people whose lives were often marked by separation. The dove appears across cultures with remarkable consistency. In Mesopotamia, one of the world's oldest civilizations, doves were sacred to Inanna, the goddess of love, war, fertility, and power. The Sumerians and later the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all knew her. They called her Ishtar. Inanna was complex. She was not gentle. She was fierce, sensual, and powerful, embodying desire alongside authority and warfare. The doves associated with her were not symbolic decorations placed beside the goddess by chance. They represented the goddess herself. Inanna moved freely between roles. She seduced, commanded, punished, and blessed. Love under her influence was not passive or restrained. The dove, later imagined as soft and peaceful, originally carried the weight of generative desire and the power to bind bodies and produce life. Archaeological evidence supports this association. Doves appear on cultic objects linked to Inanna, dating back to the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Lead dove figurines have been discovered in temples dedicated to Ishtar in Assur, and a painted fresco from Mari shows a giant dove emerging from a palm tree within her temple, suggesting the goddess herself could take this form. These objects were not decorative. They marked sacred space. To place a dove within a temple was to invoke the presence of the goddess herself, allowing fertility, protection, and power to flow into the surrounding land and people. In Greek mythology, the dove later became associated with Aphrodite, whom the Greeks revered as the goddess of love and beauty. The Romans absorbed this tradition and called her Venus. By this time, the connection between the goddess and the bird was already firmly established. According to legend, doves accompanied Aphrodite from her birth. When she emerged from the sea foam near Cyprus, doves guided her to shore. In art and myth, they fluttered around her or rested in her hand, sacred to her in a way few other creatures were. Aphrodite represented a different expression of love than Inanna, but the connection remained clear. Where Inanna ruled desire as power, Aphrodite embodied attraction as force. She altered relationships, stirred longing, and bound people together in ways that could not easily be undone. The gentle cooing of doves was heard as a sound of devotion and affection, aligning closely with what Aphrodite represented. Yet their mating behavior was equally important. Doves form strong pair bonds, mate for life, and remain attached to the same partner across multiple breeding seasons. Ancient observers noticed this consistency. Doves returned to the same mate, the same nest, and the same shared space. Separation was often followed by reunion, offering a living image of attachment that endured beyond momentary desire. For ancient peoples, this made doves powerful symbols of conjugal fidelity. Offering a pair of doves as a wedding gift was not decorative, but a blessing, a wish that the couple would remain devoted to one another as doves remain devoted. In the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world, Iron Age shrines depict doves perched above doorways. One example from Cyprus shows a shrine covered with dovecotes, linking the idea of home with fertility, protection, and continuity across generations. The dove also represented fertility and procreation. It became a symbol of the Canaanite goddess Asherah and her Phoenician counterpart Tanit. Coins from Ashkelon bore the image of a dove, representing both the goddess and the prosperity of the city. In ancient Rome, goddesses such as Venus and Fortuna were often depicted with a dove resting in their hand or on their head. The image became iconic. Love here was not only emotion, but alignment, timing, and shared fate. In Egyptian tradition, the dove was associated with Isis, a goddess of magic, motherhood, and fertility. Doves served as her messengers, their white feathers symbolizing innocence and care. They appeared in rituals, ceremonies, and temple imagery. The dove's symbolism carried a dual nature. It represented both peaceful devotion and active sensuality. Under Inanna, it was never passive. It embodied the power to desire, to create, and to act. This combination of devotion and desire made the dove an ideal symbol of romantic love in all its complexity. Love was not only soft, it was also generative, not only peaceful, but passionate. In medieval and Renaissance art, the dove continued to carry these layered meanings. As Christian symbolism rose, sensual associations receded, and the dove became linked primarily to peace and the Holy Spirit. Yet, older meanings persisted beneath the surface. In Chinese culture, paired birds symbolized harmony and marital happiness. Two doves together conveyed the hope of lasting fidelity. Attachment, balance, and shared rhythm mattered more than desire alone. Today, the dove is widely recognized as a symbol of love and peace, but ancient cultures understood something deeper. Love involves attraction and attachment, tenderness and power, devotion and continuation. The dove did not represent escape from the world. It represented staying within it, bound to another and continuing. Deer and stags, desire and transgression. If doves represent attachment and fidelity, stags and deer in mythology represent something more dangerous. They embody desire that crosses boundaries, pursuit that leads to transformation, and encounters that permanently change the person who experiences them. Across many traditions, deer are not passive animals observed from a distance. They appear suddenly, draw attention, and then vanish. This quality made them natural symbols of temptation and pursuit. What is glimpsed is not easily held. What is followed may not be safely reached. In Celtic tradition, one of the most powerful figures in mythology is the white stag. This is not an ordinary deer. The white stag is rare, otherworldly, and deeply significant. Its appearance signals that something sacred or forbidden is near. To see one is to be chosen, though not necessarily for happiness. The white stag often appears as a messenger or guide to the other world. In the legends of King Arthur, pursuing it frequently marks the beginning of a quest. The animal draws knights away from the known world and into unfamiliar terrain. Once the pursuit begins, ordinary obligations fall away. The white stag cannot be caught. Hunters may pursue it for days, exhausting themselves while the animal remains just beyond reach. This elusiveness made the stag a symbol of spiritual aspiration. Meaning and transformation remain distant. What matters is not arrival, but the act of seeking itself. In many Celtic stories, the white stag appears at moments of boundary crossing. It leads individuals into spaces where the normal rules of society no longer apply. Forests become thresholds, paths dissolve, time behaves differently. The color white carried special meaning in Celtic symbolism. White animals were associated with the supernatural and the divine. They belonged neither fully to this world nor entirely to another. A white stag was not prey in the ordinary sense. It was an invitation. Beyond the white stag, deer and stags more broadly carried strong associations with desire. During mating season, male stags clashed violently for dominance. Their antlers, grown and shed each year, symbolized vigor, renewal, and physical vitality. The stag embodied raw, sensual power moving through natural cycles. In Greek mythology, This energy becomes central in the story of Actaeon. Actaeon was a young, handsome, skilled hunter, confident and accustomed to pursuit. He was comfortable in the forest and confident in his success. His story begins, as many myths do, with separation. On a day that began like many others, Actaeon entered the forest in pursuit of the hunt, moving with his dogs through the wild landscape. As he followed its movement deeper into the woods, he gradually drifted away from his companions. The forest drew his attention forward, step by step, until the presence of others had quietly fallen behind. In myth, such moments matter. What happens next unfolds where rules no longer protect him. Drawn by a sound ahead, Actaeon moved off the path, unaware of what he was about to see. Threading his way through the woods, Actaeon was drawn toward a hidden place where the goddess Artemis, the divine huntress, bathed with her nymphs. It was a moment never meant for mortal eyes. Artemis was fiercely protective of her autonomy, and the place where she bathed was sacred, set apart by strict and ancient boundaries. By seeing her unclothed, Actaeon crossed a line he could not see. Whether the moment was accidental or not, the consequence was the same. The goddess responded immediately. In the version told by Callimachus, Artemis splashed Actaeon with water and spoke a curse. His body began to change. Antlers burst from his head. His form shifted until he stood as a stag. Transformation in myth is rarely merciful. Actaeon retained awareness but lost his human voice. He could not explain what had happened or call for help. His change isolated him completely. The transformation did not save him. His hunting dogs, trained to pursue and kill, caught his scent. Unable to recognize their master, they attacked. The hunter became the hunted. The myth of Actaeon is often read as a warning about transgression. To look upon what is forbidden brings destruction. The stag form is not protection, it is exposure. Another interpretation runs deeper. Actaeon is not killed directly by the goddess, but by his own dogs. The tools of his desire and skill turn against him. Pursuit, once unleashed, consumes the pursuer. Similar themes appear in Celtic and Germanic traditions. Stags guide humans into the otherworld. A chase that feels brief may erase years of mortal life. Time bends around desire. Antlers carry symbolic weight of their own. They resemble branching trees, linking the stag to forests and cycles of growth. Each year they are shed and regrown. Desire returns again and again, unchanged by consequence. In Celtic art and myth, stags often appear alongside supernatural beings. A stag encountered in the forest may be a god, a fairy, or a transformed human. Appearances cannot be trusted. In Scottish and Irish tales, goddesses sometimes take the form of deer. The goddess Fledias is one such figure. As a deer, she possesses strength and independence, but remains unreachable. Unlike the dove, the stag does not represent lasting union. Male stags compete intensely during mating season, driven by instinct rather than loyalty. Their desire is powerful, brief, and cyclical. This makes the stag an ambiguous symbol of romance. It represents desire in its rawest form, but also its danger. Boundaries are crossed, identities dissolve. What is pursued may destroy the pursuer. Yet again and again, people follow the stag. Across Celtic, Germanic, and Greek traditions, humans pursue it despite the warnings. This persistence reveals something essential about desire. We are drawn toward what transforms us, even when transformation carries a cost. Swans, transformation and bonding. The swan occupies a unique place in mythology. Unlike most animals, the swan is associated with transformation from the beginning. To be a swan, or to encounter a swan, is to exist in a state of metamorphosis. Across cultures, swans are rarely static creatures. They move between water, land, and air with ease, inhabiting multiple realms at once. This natural fluidity made them powerful symbols for change, transition, and the uncertainty that comes with crossing from one state of being into another. One of the most famous swan myths in Western tradition is the story of Leda and the swan. According to Greek mythology, Hera, the wife of Zeus, was perpetually suspicious of her husband's infidelities. To avoid her detection, Zeus often transformed himself into other forms. Zeus was known not only for his power, but for his willingness to disguise himself to achieve his desires. Transformation allowed him to approach mortals without revealing his true nature. One day, Zeus desired a woman named Leda, the queen of Sparta. He transformed himself into a magnificent swan. In some versions of the myth, he pretended to flee from a pursuing eagle and sought refuge with Leda. In other versions, he simply approached her as a beautiful bird. Leda, moved by the swan's apparent distress or enchanted by its beauty, took the bird into her arms. In that embrace, Zeus seduced her. According to some versions of the story, Leda later laid eggs from this union, and from those eggs hatched divine children. Helen of Troy, perhaps the most famous woman in Greek mythology, is said to be one of these offspring. The myth of Leda and the swan carries multiple layers of meaning. The swan appears as a symbol of purity and beauty, yet it is also a form of deception. Zeus uses transformation to bypass Leda's ordinary defenses. Grace conceals divine intention. Transformation itself lies at the center of the story. Identity becomes unstable. What does consent mean when appearance cannot be trusted? The myth does not offer clear answers. Instead, it leaves unease in its wake, reminding listeners that appearances can mislead and power often hides behind beauty. Northern European folklore presents a very different relationship with the swan. In Celtic, Germanic, and Nordic traditions, swan maidens appear frequently in myth and legend. These are women who can move freely between human and swan form. Unlike Zeus, the swan maidens are not deceivers. Their transformations are part of their identity rather than tools of manipulation. They belong to both worlds and fully to neither. The key to their transformation is usually a swan skin or a cloak made of feathers. A man encounters a swan maiden bathing in a lake and steals her feathers while she is vulnerable. Without them, she cannot transform back. She becomes trapped in human form. This act of theft changes the nature of the relationship from the beginning. What may appear as romance is built on captivity. The man gains a wife, but only by denying her true nature. Many versions of the story recount that the swan maiden marries the man and bears him children. Outwardly, the family appears whole, yet the swan maiden remains restless. She longs for flight, for water, for the freedom of her former life. Eventually, she recovers her hidden feathers or cloak. When she does, the choice is immediate. She transforms back into a swan and leaves, often without farewell, abandoning her human family. These stories reveal something important about bonding and transformation. Love that requires the loss of one's essential nature cannot endure. The swan maiden is powerful because of her ability to change, not in spite of it. To love her fully would require accepting that she cannot be owned or contained. The swan maiden appears across ancient Celtic lands and throughout Nordic regions, especially Scandinavia. The story traveled widely, adapting to local landscapes while preserving its central structure. Across these variations, the message remains consistent. In Irish mythology, one of the most enduring swan transformation stories is the tale of the Children of Lear, a medieval narrative later preserved in Christian manuscripts. In the story, 4 children are cursed by their stepmother to live as swans for 900 years. The curse forces them to inhabit lakes and seas across Ireland, enduring isolation, cold, and the slow passage of centuries. Their transformation is not chosen. It is imposed. Yet, over time, the children adapt to their swan form. They learn to survive the water and the weather. Most importantly, they preserve their bond with one another. They sing haunting songs that carry across the water, maintaining their shared identity despite their altered bodies. The story becomes one of endurance rather than escape. Transformation here is suffering, but also continuity. The children remain themselves through loyalty and memory. Its themes later echoed in European folklore and artistic traditions, including works such as Swan Lake. In Indian tradition, the swan carries a very different meaning. Known as the Hamsa or Hansa in Sanskrit, the swan is the sacred bird of Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, wisdom, and the arts. It is also the sacred vehicle of Brahma, the creator god. In this context, the swan is not tragic. It is elevated. It represents discernment, clarity, and spiritual insight. The word Hamza is associated with the rhythm of breath itself. Inhalation and exhalation echo the sound hamso. This connection links the swan to prana, the life force that animates all beings. Ancient texts describe the Hamsa as capable of separating what is pure from what is impure. In symbolic language, it consumes a serpent, representing vice or ignorance, and then seeks fresh water. Through its nature, it refines what is harmful into something clear. In Hindu philosophy, the Hamsa represents the union of opposites. The phrase soaham, meaning that I am, reflects the merging of individual identity with universal reality. The swan's flight becomes a metaphor for liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Unlike the swan maiden of European folklore, the Hamsa is not trapped by transformation. Transformation is its fulfillment. The goal of spiritual practice is to become like the Hamsa, free, discerning, and unbound by illusion. Across Greek myth, Northern European folklore, and Indian philosophy, the swan remains bound to change. Sometimes transformation deceives, sometimes it liberates, sometimes it brings prolonged suffering. Across all these traditions, one theme remains constant. Deep connection cannot be separated from the possibility of change. To bond with a swan is to accept uncertainty. Love and identity remain fluid. The swan teaches that transformation is not an interruption of life, it is one of its central conditions. Fish, harmony, fate, and shared destiny. Fish appear in mythology less frequently than birds, but when they do appear in stories of love and union, they carry a particular weight. Fish are creatures of movement rather than display. They do not call attention to themselves through song or flight. Instead, they move together through a shared medium. For this reason, they came to represent harmony, shared destiny, and the quiet balance that allows love to endure. Across cultures, fish are rarely solitary symbols. They are most often depicted in pairs. Their movement through water is smooth and coordinated, suggesting cooperation rather than dominance. This visual language made fish powerful metaphors for partnership. In Chinese tradition, fish symbolism is unusually precise. The Chinese word for fish, yu, shares its sound with words meaning abundance, plenty, and wealth. This coincidence of sound was not treated as accidental. It gave fish strong symbolic power, linking them to prosperity and good fortune. Paired fish carried special meaning. Two fish swimming together, especially when shown touching or intertwined, represented marital harmony and conjugal fidelity. They symbolized a bond that moved in unison. Fish were believed to swim naturally in pairs, reinforcing the idea that devotion was part of their nature. For this reason, giving a pair of fish as a wedding gift became highly auspicious. It was not merely decorative, it expressed a wish for happiness, loyalty, prosperity, and children. Abundance, fertility, and long life were understood as interconnected aspects of a successful union. The fish most often used in this symbolism was the carp. The carp was admired across Asia for its size, beauty, and longevity. In India and Tibet, the golden carp was especially revered. Its long lifespan made it a natural emblem of enduring marriage and continuity across generations. The symbolism of paired fish did not originate in China alone. In ancient India, the image was associated with the two sacred rivers, the Ganges and the Yamuna. These rivers were understood not only as physical waterways, but as symbolic channels within the human body. The rivers were linked to breath and the movement of life force. Fish living within them came to represent the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. In this context, paired fish symbolized balance within the self, as well as harmony between partners. Marriage mirrored the flow of the rivers, distinct currents moving together to sustain life. In Mesopotamia, fish carried a different but related meaning. They were sacred to Enki, also known as Ea, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and creation. Enki was a god of origins, associated with the deep waters from which life emerged. In Mesopotamian art, Enki is often shown with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, with fish swimming within them. The imagery is explicit. Water brings life, and fish move within its sustaining flow. Fish symbolized fertility and generative power. In Sumerian writing, the same cuneiform sign was sometimes used to represent both water and semen. This direct association linked fish to procreation and continuity. Yet Enki was not only a fertility god, he was also associated with fate and foreknowledge. He understood the patterns of the future and the unfolding of events. Fish thus came to represent not only abundance, but continuity through time. They moved steadily forward, carried by currents beyond individual control. In ancient Syrian mythology, the goddess Atargatis, also known as Dursito, embodies another aspect of fish symbolism. She appears as a hybrid being, half woman and half fish, inhabiting the boundary between land and water. In one version of her myth, Atargatis falls in love with a mortal man named Simios. Overcome by shame at this union, she casts herself into a lake and transforms into a fish, though her human head remains. The transformation is incomplete, reflecting the tension between divine nature and mortal attachment. The image captures a recurring theme in romantic mythology. Divine beings who love mortals must change themselves, but the change is rarely stable. The goddess cannot fully become human, just as she cannot fully abandon her former nature. In another version of the myth, Atargatis is associated with both doves and fish. The doves symbolize love and femininity. The fish symbolize fertility and continuity. Together, they represent attraction, union, and creation as a complete cycle. Fish also appear in a Syrian myth involving Dione and Eros. According to this account, Dione, sometimes understood as an aspect of the goddess Aphrodite, and her son Eros fled into the Euphrates River to escape the monstrous Typhon. As they struggled in the water, a pair of fish came to their aid, carrying them to safety. This act of rescue was honored by placing the fish among the stars as the constellation Pisces. To this day, Pisces represents paired devotion and mutual protection. Because of this myth, Syrians abstained from eating fish. The fish had earned reverence through loyalty and intervention. Here, fish represent active love, expressed through rescue rather than desire. In Chinese zodiac tradition, the two fish associated with Pisces are linked to the balance of yin and yang. The black and white forms of the yin-yang symbol are sometimes interpreted as two fish moving in perfect counterbalance. Neither fish exists independently. Each movement of one is mirrored by the other. Harmony emerges not through sameness, but through complementary motion. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, fish continue to carry symbolic meaning. Koi fish, a variation of carp, are associated with perseverance and transformation. The legend of the Dragon Gate tells of a koi that swims upstream against powerful currents. After overcoming waterfalls and obstacles, the koi reaches the summit and transforms into a dragon. The story suggests that endurance and shared movement lead to transformation. Effort, when sustained, reshapes destiny. Across cultures, fish in romantic mythology rarely symbolize passion in its raw form. Instead, they represent balance, continuity, and shared movement through time. They embody love that is not loud or consuming, but steady and sustaining. Fish swim together because their nature is relational. They move through water as partners move through life, shaped by currents they cannot control, but navigating them together. In myth, fish remind us that love endures not through force, but through harmony. Serpents and reptilian beings. Taboo and transformation. Of all the creatures associated with romance and mythology, serpents are among the most complex and unsettling. They draw attention and fear at the same time. Smooth, silent, and alert, serpents embody attraction paired with danger. They heal and poison, protect and destroy, renew and threaten. Across cultures, the serpent often appears at the edge of what is permitted. To encounter a serpent in myth is rarely neutral. It signals that a boundary is near and that crossing it will carry consequences. In Indian mythology, the Naga occupies a central place in this symbolic landscape. Nagas are serpentine beings, sometimes shown fully as snakes, sometimes depicted with human upper bodies and coiled lower forms. They exist between worlds, neither fully animal nor fully human. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, Nagas are not demons or embodiments of evil. They are guardians of hidden treasures and keepers of sacred waters. They dwell in subterranean or underwater realms known as Bhogavati, a name that translates to the land of pleasure. Their association with water links them to fertility, nourishment, and the sustaining force of life. The king of the serpents in Hindu mythology is Vasuki. Stories surrounding Vasuki and other male Nagas frequently involve relationships with human women. These unions are never simple romances. They are encounters between fundamentally different forms of existence. One recurring story tells of a Naga prince who falls in love with a human village girl. When the prince reveals his true nature and returns to serpent form, the girl does not recoil. Instead, she accepts him. His parents bless the union by giving her a lotus flower, a symbol of purity and renewal. The girl brings the lotus home and sleeps. By morning, the flower has transformed into a diamond. Wealth follows, and the marriage is approved. Transformation accompanies acceptance. Material fortune mirrors spiritual openness. The couple lives part of the year on land and part in the river, where the husband resumes his Naga form. Their bond is real, but it demands accommodation. The woman must accept a husband who cannot fully live in her world, just as she cannot fully live in his. This pattern appears across many cultures. Love between human and serpent is marked by distance and negotiation. The relationship survives only when otherness is acknowledged rather than denied. In Baltic folklore, similar themes emerge. A Lithuanian fairy tale known as Eglė, Queen of Serpents, is one of the most haunting expressions of this pattern. In the story, Eglė encounters a serpent who hides her clothing while she bathes in a lake. The serpent demands marriage in exchange for its return. She consents, and over time, she learns that her husband is not monstrous. He provides for her, protects her, and treats her with care. Life with the serpent is strange, but not cruel. Yet pressure from her human family erodes this fragile trust. Urged to uncover her husband's vulnerability, Eglė betrays him. The Serpent King is killed. In the aftermath, transformation sweeps through the family. Eglė becomes an aspen tree, condemned to tremble endlessly in the wind. Her siblings are transformed into other trees. Love ends not in reconciliation, but in permanent change. The story suggests that love across fundamental difference demands unwavering trust. Once that trust is broken, transformation becomes punishment rather than renewal. Other Baltic tales repeat the theme. In one, a woman brings a snake into her bed to warm it. The snake reveals itself as a prince under a curse. Only acceptance of his true nature can free him. Doubt delays transformation. Fear sustains the curse. In Mesoamerican mythology, the serpent takes on cosmic scale through Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. This deity unites the serpent of the earth with the bird of the sky, bridging matter and spirit. Quetzalcoatl embodies renewal, fertility, and order. The serpent sheds its skin, and in doing so becomes a living symbol of rebirth. Transformation here is not tragic, but necessary for creation itself. Across Indian, Baltic, Mesoamerican, and European traditions, serpents represent a particular kind of love. It is love that crosses boundaries between the human and the non-human, the familiar and the alien. The serpent sheds its skin repeatedly. This makes it a powerful symbol of renewal, but also an unsettling one. To love a serpent is to love something that can abandon its former self and return altered. In many myths, unions between humans and serpents produce powerful offspring. These children carry both human intelligence and serpent wisdom, yet they often belong fully to neither world, marked by inherited difference. In medieval European folklore, this tension appears in the legend of Melusine. Melusine marries a human knight on one condition: he must never look upon her while she bathes. For years, the boundary is honored, the marriage prospers, but curiosity eventually overwhelms restraint. When the knight spies on her and sees her serpent form, the spell is broken. Melusine does not die. Instead, she withdraws permanently from the human world. The marriage ends not because love was absent, but because a boundary could not be respected. These myths suggest that love involving serpents cannot be fully domesticated. The serpent remains other, retaining a nature that resists containment. Acceptance requires tolerance for strangeness that many cannot sustain. Yet again and again, humans pursue these unions. Despite fear, despite taboo, despite the certainty of transformation, they persist. The serpent draws us because it embodies risk itself. In romantic mythology, the serpent is not a symbol of comfort. It is a symbol of love's danger, the danger of crossing boundaries, of surrendering certainty, and of being changed beyond recognition. To love a serpent is to accept transformation without guarantee. It is to embrace the possibility that love may heal, may enrich, or may destroy. The serpent reminds us that the most powerful bonds are also the most perilous. Conclusion: the role of animals in stories of romance. We have moved through a small group of creatures and the stories that formed around them. The nightingale carried memory and feeling. The dove stayed close and returned. The stag crossed boundaries and altered direction. The swan shifted form and moved between worlds. The fish traveled in pairs, shaped by shared currents. The serpent embodied difference and transformation. Together, these stories do not explain love. They observe it. In myth, romance is not treated as an ending or a destination. It is treated as a movement, something that begins, unfolds, and changes those who take part in it. Sometimes love draws beings closer. Sometimes it reshapes them. Sometimes it creates harmony. Sometimes it opens a passage into something unfamiliar. None of these possibilities are presented as mistakes. They are simply part of the pattern. The people who told these stories watched the natural world carefully. They saw how animals moved, bonded, separated, returned, and transformed. In those movements, they recognized something human. These creatures were not chosen at random. Each one reflects a way that connection can exist, not as perfection, but as experience. What remains after all the stories is not instruction, it is recognition. Love appears as something living, something that moves, something that connects without erasing difference. That understanding is why these images endure. They stay with us because they still feel familiar, because they still resemble what it is like to care, to bond, and to be changed in the process. And in that recognition, there is something quietly affirming.